Hi guys, welcome to our review lecture of Chapter 6, Skin and the Integumentary System. This is our first dive into organ systems. The skin's, I think by weight, weighs about 20 pounds if you took it off you all at once. And, you could maybe say it's one of the biggest organs of your body. It has a lot of roles that maybe aren't so obvious. One of the things about skin is that it's just so intimate, and so anybody who's had any afflictions with skin knows just how difficult they can be to navigate in terms of treatment, but also in terms of psychology. So the skin does a lot of different things. It's really important in maintaining homeostasis. If you recollect from biology, we talked about how the cell membrane really controls cellular homeostatic functions. Well, the same thing's true for your skin. It's the outermost layer. It protects you. It retards water loss. It helps maintain thermal regulation. It's your connection to the world. That's how you sense the world, is with your skin. It has lots of immune cells, right? You can imagine that, one way for bacteria and virus, even protists to attack you is through your skin, and so there's lots of immune function cells there. It synthesizes important vitamins and cofactors, and it even excretes waste. It's an excretory organ as well. You can see down here on the lower right, there's an animation that shows the hair follicles standing on end, and so that's a vestigial reaction. Back in the days when we had fur, by standing those hairs up, it actually create a trapped dead airspace. You may not think that air is a good insulator, but in fact it is, especially if it's not moving, and so fur can trap air, and that's where your hair stands up on it when you're cold. There's 3 layers of skin: the epidermis, dermis, and subcutaneous layer. And the outermost layer, or the epidermis, is really responsible for making sure you don't lose water. Just beneath that is the dermis, and the dermis is made up of loose connective tissue, and it varies. Loose connective tissue is kind of funny. It can also be called areolar tissue. Adipose is a form of loose connective tissue. It's also called areolar tissue. And the dermis is areolar, loose connective tissue, and as I progress deeper and deeper into the dermis, I find it's more and more composed of a dense, irregular connective tissue, which is a slide we didn't look at in histology, but there it is. Last but not least is the subcutaneous layer, or hypodermis, and this is made up of adipose. You find big blood vessels down here. We'll learn a little bit about more of that in a minute. The epidermis. Remember, the epidermis is the outermost layer. It's epi, and remember what covers us is the tissue called epithelium. So the epidermis is made up of epithelium. Remember, epithelial tissues are avascular, so they don't have any blood vessels. Your skin varies in thickness. The palms of your hands and soles of your feet have the thickest type of epithelium. And there's a few specialized cell types in the epidermis and epithelium proper. One of them is the melanocyte, and the melanocyte is a cell. It's found deep in the epidermis, in the basal stratum, and it makes the pigment melanin. Now, most pigments are proteins that coordinate metal ions. So, for instance, the pigment hemoglobin has a special coordinating area called the heme group that actually holds in place or loosely binds an iron atom. In the case of the chlorophyll pigments, they have a protein that coordinates a manganese ion. Melanin's a pigment, but it doesn't have any metal ions. And of course, melanin's really good at absorbing almost all forms of visible light and UV light. Remember that the role of melanin as a pigment is to protect the skin and the underlying layers by absorbing UV light, which has powerful carcinogenic, mutagenic effects. And of course, it's epithelium, so it has a free surface area, and then of course it has another area that's connected to connective tissue, and that's connected by the basement membrane. We can also see in this diagram here a couple different cells. There's a Merkel cell is actually a sense receptor that senses light touch, but they're kind of rare cells. And then I have a Langerhans cell. Now, Langerhans cells is a macrophage. If you remember from our previous discussions in histology, we find macrophages in connective tissue, but this is a macrophage we find in epithelium, and it actually ingests, it's a macrophage, it ingests particles, and then it presents those proteins present from those digested particles to the humoral immune system. So it's an antigen-presenting cell. You can also see that I have keratinocytes, and a keratinocyte is really just sort of the end product of epithelial tissues. At the bottom of the epithelium in the stratum basale, these cells are relatively undifferentiated. They're just proliferating. They're undergoing mitosis, and as they progress up through the layers of the skin to the stratum spinosum, they begin to undergo differentiation. In the stratum spinosum, the layer is notable because it has little fine fibers. These are fibers between adjacent cells made up of actin, and we have connections between cells called desmosomes. So the stratum spinosum, you see little fibers in it, and then we progress up into the stratum granulosum. This whole time, the cells are undergoing what's called terminal differentiation. That is, they're changing from relatively pluripotent cells, that is, cells with lots of different potential, to dedicated cells. And the final terminal differentiated state is a keratinocyte. And what's it doing? Well, it's making keratin, the protein. You can see granules in the stratum granulosum, and those granules are made up of keratohyalin, which is a complex of keratin and some fibers that make up hyaline cartilage. In the stratum lucidum, we have a clear layer of skin, and it's notable because it's only found in the palms of the hands, soles of the feet. I don't know why it's clear. Read about it. Lastly, but not least, is the stratum corneum. And in the stratum corneum, we have the keratinocyte that's fully differentiated. It's become desiccated. It combines with the secretions of the sebaceous gland to make a watertight outer layer, just like the copperhead. So we have the stratum corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, basale from outer to inner. The corneum can be called cornified layer or keratinized epithelium. Lucidum only in the palms of the hands, soles of the feet. Granulosum has those granules of keratohyalin, right, and that helps keratin adhere to itself to make a waterproof layer. In the spinosum, we see fibrils between desmosomes, and in basale, it's right down at the bottom, and I find the basement membrane there. Which leads us to the dermis. Okay, so this is the second layer of skin, and one of the first things you see when you peel back the epidermis from the dermis are these little tiny finger-like projections called the dermal papillae. And these projections from the dermis into the epidermis, or invaginations of the dermis into the epidermis, are there to provide a mechanical purchase to help connect the two layers of the skin. In fact, there's some horrible diseases that affect dermal papillae formation, and your skin just kind of slides off of you. Not only that, but the dermal papillae in your palms, your hands, and soles of your feet give rise to fingerprints. Now, the dermis properly is made up of loose connective tissue, and if you recollect from the last couple of slides, I said that as I go deeper into the dermis, I find more and more irregular, dense connective tissue. I've got a slide down there of dense irregular tissue, just to gussy up what we didn't see in Chapter 5 histology. The dermis is connective tissue, but this is really where most of the ancillary organs of the skin arise. Okay, and so there's a bunch of ancillary organs: the sebaceous glands, the eccrine sweat glands, the apocrine sweat glands, etc. And they're all sort of, this is where it happens in the dermis. You have smooth muscle called the erector pillae muscle, and remember we saw that in the first slide. It helps your hair follicles stand up on end. It's controlled by the autonomic nervous system. You can't control your hair standing up end, and we all know that if you've ever gotten scared to get your hair standing up on end, you're not in control of it. Each hair follicle is associated with a sebaceous gland, and sebaceous glands are these large glands that secrete sebum. Remember that back in the day we talked about exocrine glands, and this is a holocrine exocrine gland, the sebaceous gland. It secretes substances and whole cells. Okay, and it's always associated with a hair follicle. In fact, it helps the hair root and the hair shaft itself stay together. And it also actually, the sebum that's secreted by the sebaceous gland helps the outer layer or the stratum corneum become watertight. We also have deep sensory cells called the Pacinian corpuscle. We talked about this in class. This is a sensory cell. If I squeeze this thing, it sends off a nerve impulse. And Pacinian corpuscle sense pressure, P to P, pressure. There's another sensory organ or sensory neuron here called Meissner's corpuscle. These guys are superficial and they're associated with light touch. Okay, light touch. And remember, there's a Merkel disc actually in the epithelium that was associated with light touch. And so if you looked at those really sensitive areas of your skin, you'd expect to see lots of Meissner's corpuscles and maybe some Merkel discs as well. Each hair follicle has its own capillary and a nerve. There are loose nerve endings. They're important for sensing pain and heat and stretch. And what did I miss? Oh, the most common type of sweat gland is called the eccrine sweat gland. It's a American exocrine gland. It just makes sweat. That's its secretion, and sweat is just water and salt. On the other hand, here's the apocrine sweat gland, and it's associated with the sebaceous gland. It dumps its contents in here, and it combines to make this weird apocrine exudates. We'll talk about it in a minute. Last but not least is a subcutaneous layer, made up primarily of adipose tissue. Adipocytes are those fat cells that store triglycerides. That fat tissue has lots of roles. It obviously stores energy. It cushions you. It insulates your body, keeps heat in, keeps heat out, keeps cold out. It's a form of loose connective tissue, areolar tissues. And, when you get into the fat, you're going to find some bigger blood vessels. In the dermis, you'll find capillaries, maybe some arterioles and venules, but deeper you go, the bigger those blood vessels get.